They will tell you a queen is made in a cathedral, beneath a vault of gold and the breath of 1,000 witnesses. They are wrong. A queen is made in the small rooms, the ones with no windows, where men who never bow decide what a woman is allowed to be. Rowena of Valmere learned this on the coldest morning of her life, when a single sheet of paper, folded 3 times and sealed in wax the color of dried blood, arrived on the silver tray that usually carried her morning letters. She did not know yet that it would unmake her. She only knew that the servant who brought it would not meet her eyes, and that in a palace built on ceremony, the breaking of a small habit is always the first sound of something enormous coming apart. The kingdom of Aldermere sat at the mouth of 2 rivers, a country of gray stone and green hills, where the crown had passed from hand to hand for 600 years without ever once passing to a woman by right. Rowena had understood the arithmetic of that fact long before she married into it. She had been the daughter of a border lord, not poor, never poor, but far enough from the center of things that the court had regarded her arrival with the polite contempt reserved for the almost important. When King Alden had chosen her, 12 years ago now, the whispers had followed her down every corridor like a draft she could never quite close a door against. He could have had a princess of the eastern houses. He could have had gold, alliance, an heir bred from 3 generations of proper blood. Instead, he chose her. She had made them wrong slowly in the only way that lasts. Not with beauty, though she had enough of it. Not with cleverness displayed, which courtiers forgive in no one. She had made them wrong by being useful and being kind and being present in 10,000 small moments that no chronicle would ever record. When the fever swept the lower town 4 winters past, it was Rowena who emptied the royal stores of grain against the treasury's shrieking objection. When old Lord Merrick's son died in the border skirmishes, it was Rowena who sat with the grieving man through a night no one else would give him. The people did not love her because she was their queen. They loved her because she had, again and again, chosen them when choosing them cost her something. But love from below has never once protected anyone from the knives above. She broke the seal with her thumb. She had always disliked letter openers. Her mother had taught her that a woman who opens her own correspondence with her own hands is a woman who is not afraid of what it might contain. The wax cracked, the paper unfolded, and Rowena of Valmere, queen consort of Aldermere by the grace of a marriage 12 years sworn, read the 17 lines that dissolved her. They were written in the flat, boneless language of the law. Whereas the title of queen consort is conferred not by marriage alone, but by the ongoing assent of the crowning council. Whereas certain conditions of that assent are found to be unmet, it is hereby determined that the style, dignity, and title heretofore borne shall, upon the sealing of this instrument, be withdrawn and held in abeyance. There was more. There was always more in documents like these, the clauses that explain nothing while pretending to explain everything, the signatures, the seal, but she had stopped reading it withdrawn. The word sat in her chest like a swallowed stone. She read it again, then a 3rd time. The room did not change around her. That was the strange thing, the thing she would remember later with a kind of horrified wonder. The fire still burned in the grate. The morning light still fell in its long gold bars across the floor she had walked 10,000 times. Somewhere below her window, a gardener was singing, tunelessly, the way men sing when they think no one important can hear them. The world had not noticed that it had ended. She set the paper down on the table with great care, as though it might detonate. And then she did the thing that had carried her through 12 years of a court that had never quite decided to accept her. She thought. Who signed it? The signature at the bottom was the king's. She knew his hand as well as she knew her own, the hard downstroke on the A of Alden, the way he never quite closed his os. But Rowena had learned in 12 years of watching that a signature proves only that a hand moved. It does not prove that a mind was behind the hand, or that the mind was free, or that the man knew what he signed. And Alden, her Alden, who 3 nights ago had fallen asleep with his head against her shoulder and murmured that she was the only honest thing in a palace full of liars. Alden was not a man who would strip his wife of her name and let her learn it from a breakfast tray. Unless he had not known what the paper was, or unless something had changed in him that she had not yet seen. The distinction, she understood with sudden and total clarity, was the only thing that mattered in the world. And she was going to have to find out which was true before the men who had drafted this document realized that she intended to fight it. She dressed herself. This, too, was a decision. Every morning of her married life had begun with 2 maids, a ritual of laces and pins and the day's chosen jewels, and every morning she had submitted to it because a queen who is dressed by others is a queen whose body belongs, in some small way, to the institution. This morning she sent them away at the door with a smile she did not feel, and she stood before the tall glass alone and put on the plainest gown she owned, the gray wool she wore only when she meant to walk the lower town unnoticed. If they were going to take the queen, she would meet them as the woman. There was a kind of armor in that. Let them wonder why she had not clothed herself in outrage and silk. Let them wonder what she knew. The corridor outside her apartments was the first test. There were always guards at her door, 2 of them, men of the household company, chosen for loyalty and dullness in equal measure. This morning there were still 2 men, but they were not her men. She knew every face in the household company. She had made a point of it years ago, had learned their names and their wives' names and the names of the children whose christenings she had gifted. These 2 she had never seen. They wore the right colors. They stood in the right place. And when she stepped into the corridor, they did not bow. So it had been arranged in the night then. Whoever had drafted the document had also thought to replace the men who might have carried word to her or opened a door for her that they wished closed. This was not the work of a single furious king. This was planning. This was a machine, assembled quietly over days or weeks and set to move at dawn while she slept. Rowena inclined her head to the strangers as though their failure to bow were beneath her notice, and she walked. She had learned long ago that in a palace, the woman who walks as though she has every right to be walking is rarely stopped. Confidence is a kind of forged pass. The guards read it faster than they read any seal. She went not toward the king's apartments. That would be expected, and whoever had built this machine would have accounted for it, but toward the east wing and the small library that almost no one used, because the man she needed to find began every morning there, alone, with the kingdom's law spread open before him like a body on a table. His name was Corvin Ashby, and he was the keeper of the rolls, the man responsible for every document the crown had ever sealed, the archivist of 600 years of Aldermere's memory. He was old and dry and disliked by nearly everyone, because he had the archivist's fatal habit of caring more about what was true than about what was convenient. Rowena had cultivated him for years, not out of calculation but out of genuine liking. They were, she had always thought, the same kind of creature, 2 people who had learned to survive a court by being useful in ways too tedious for anyone to resent. If any man in Aldermere knew how a queen could be unmade by paper, it was Corvin Ashby, and if any man could tell her whether the paper was even real, it was him. He was where she knew he would be, bent over a table by the tall east window, the morning light turning the dust in the air to slow gold. He looked up when the door opened, and she watched the recognition cross his face, followed, half a heartbeat behind, by something else. Fear, not fear of her, fear for her, which meant he already knew. "You've heard," she said. She did not make it a question. "Your Majesty." He rose, and his old joints protested, and she saw that his hands were not quite steady as he set down his pen. "You should not be here if they find that you came to me. Then they will learn that I am not a woman who receives a death sentence and goes quietly back to bed." She crossed to the table. "Corvin, look at me. Is it real?" He was silent for a long moment, and in that silence, Rowena understood that she had asked the wrong question, or rather the incomplete one, because the old man's face was working through something more complicated than yes or no. "The document is real," he said finally. "The seal is real, the signature," he stopped. "The signature is the king's. I would swear to it in any court in the land." But, Corvin Ashby said very quietly, "there is no such thing in the law of Aldermere as the withdrawal of a queen's title. There never has been. A queen consort holds her dignity by marriage, and by marriage alone, and it ends only when the marriage ends by death, or by a dissolution that requires the assent of the full council sitting in open session, which has not happened, because I would know, because I keep the rolls." His voice had begun to shake, and she realized with a small shock that the old man was angry, furiously, coldly angry, in a way she had never once seen in all their years of quiet friendship. "That document, Your Majesty, is written in the language of a law that does not exist. It is a forgery of authority, not of hand. Someone put a true seal and a true signature on a lie, and they did it because they were betting that no one would ever check. Because they were betting that you would read the word withdrawn and believe that the machinery of the state had already turned, when in truth the machinery has done nothing at all, because the machinery cannot do this thing." Rowena stood very still. Below her outward calm, something was turning over, slowly at first, then faster, like a great wheel finding its groove. Then why, she said, would anyone go to the trouble? If it isn't law, if it can't be law, why forge a thing that falls apart the moment someone reads it properly? And Corvin Ashby looked at her with the terrible patience of a man who has spent his life among documents and therefore understands, better than any soldier, how power actually moves. Because they do not need it to be law, he said. They need it to be believed for 3 days, perhaps 4. They need you to believe it long enough to flee or to weep or to make some desperate move that discredits you. They need the court to believe it long enough to turn its face away from you, because a court reads the weather, not the law, and the weather this morning says the Queen is finished. And most of all, they need it believed long enough for the thing that comes after the document to be done, because a forged title stripping, Your Majesty, is never the crime itself. It is the curtain drawn across the crime. The question you must ask is not, is the paper real? The question is what is happening behind it, while everyone stares at the paper. The gardener beneath the window had stopped singing. The palace had gone very quiet, the particular quiet of a great house holding its breath. And Rowena of Valmere, who was still, whatever 17 forged lines might claim, the Queen of Aldermere felt the fear in her chest turn, at last, into something colder and far more useful. Then we had better find out, she said, what they don't want me to see. There is a particular art to being invisible in a place where you are the most watched woman alive. Rowena had never needed it before. For 12 years her problem had been the opposite, the impossibility of a single unobserved moment, the way a queen is always performing even when she is alone, because the memory of being watched becomes a kind of watcher of its own. But now she needed to move through her own palace like a draft under a door, and she found, to her grim surprise, that the same instincts which had made her a good queen made her a passable ghost. She knew which corridors the servants used and which they avoided. She knew the hours when the great halls emptied. She knew, above all, the map of the palace's attention, where it pointed, and therefore where it did not. Corvin had given her 3 things before she left the library. The first was a name. Havard Crane, the Lord Chancellor, the man whose office would have had to move the true seal from its locked case for a single night, because the seal never left that case without the Chancellor's own hand turning the key. The second was a warning, that she had, by Corvin's guess, until the council convened at week's end, because whatever was being hidden behind the forged document would have to be finished and made irreversible before anyone with the standing to ask questions was in a room together. And the third thing Corvin had given her was the most dangerous of all, and he had given it reluctantly, his old hand closing over her wrist as she turned to go. If you pull this thread, he had said, you may not like the shape of the thing that comes apart. Sometimes a queen is happier not knowing what her king has done. I have kept the rolls for 40 years, Your Majesty. I have learned that the truth is not always a kindness. I did not marry a man to be kept from the truth of him, she had answered. If Alden did this knowing, then I have been a fool for 12 years, and I would rather be a fool who knows it than a fool who does not. And if he did not do it knowing, she had not finished. She had not needed to. They both understood that the second possibility was worse, because a king who could be made to seal a forgery in his own hand was a king who was no longer, in any way that mattered, holding his own crown. She went first to the thing she could verify without being seen, the king himself. She had not gone to Alden's apartments at dawn, because it was expected. She went now mid-morning, because the pattern of the palace had shifted in a way she could feel, the guards thinner in the east wing, thicker toward the council chambers, the servants moving with the pinched hurry of people who have been told to say nothing and are terrified of accidentally saying something. All the attention of the machine had turned toward whatever was being finished before week's end. And so the king's own door, for the first time in 12 years, was the least watched threshold in the building. They had assumed she would never dare. She found him at the window of his private study, and the sight of him stopped her in the doorway, because she had come braced for a stranger, for the cold, deciding face of a man who had signed her away. And instead she found Alden, her Alden, looking older than he had 3 nights ago and smaller somehow, standing at the glass with a cup of something in his hand that he did not seem to be drinking. He turned when she entered, and his face, when he saw her, was the face of a man watching the dead walk. Rowena, her name came out of him broken in the middle. They told me you had gone. They told me at first light that you had taken the North Road, that you had fled. Who told you? Crane. He set the cup down, and it rattled against the table, and she saw that his hand shook exactly as Corvin's had shaken, and understood that fear had come to this palace like a fever, touching everyone. Havard came to me at dawn and said you had learned of some matter before the council, and that you had panicked and gone, and that for the sake of the crown it must be handled quietly." He stopped. He looked at her, and the confusion in his eyes was so total, so genuine, that 12 years of knowing his face told her the truth before he said another word. "Rowena, what matter? What have you learned? What is happening in my own house that comes to me only as reports, as things I am told have already been decided?" And there it was, the shape of the silence made suddenly visible. "Alden," she crossed the room to him slowly, the way you approach a man standing at the edge of something. "This morning I was brought a document, sealed with the true seal, signed with your own hand. It stripped me of my title as queen. It said the crowning council had withdrawn my dignity." She watched his face as she spoke, and she saw the words land on him one by one, each one a small blow, and by the time she reached the end he had gone the gray of old ash. "You did not sign it knowing what it was." "I see that now. So I will ask you the only question that matters, and I need you to think very carefully before you answer. In the last month, how many papers have you signed that Havard Crane brought to you already open to the line and told you were routine?" The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. "Many," Alden said at last. His voice had gone to almost nothing. "He said after the winter illness, when my hand was still weak, he said it would spare me the strain, that he would bring the small matters already prepared, and I need only sign, and he would see to the rest. Grants, appointments, confirmations of things already agreed. I thought," he pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes, and when he spoke again his voice had the hollow horror of a man watching the floor of his own life give way. "I thought it was kindness. I thought he was sparing me. Rowena, how many things have I signed? How many things bearing my hand are moving through this kingdom that I have never truly read?" "That," said Rowena softly, "is precisely the question they are counting on you never to ask." It came together for her then, all at once, the way a scattering of separate facts will sometimes resolve into a single terrible picture. The forged title stripping was not aimed at her. Or rather, it was aimed at her the way a stone is aimed at a window, not because the stone hates the glass, but because the glass is the thing that must break for the room beyond to be reached. She was the loudest, most visible thing in the palace that could be made to move. Strip the queen, and every eye in Aldermere turns to the scandal, to the disgraced woman, the failing marriage, the succession thrown into doubt. And while every eye is turned there in the deafening noise of it, a Lord Chancellor with a weakened king and a stack of pre-opened papers could seal anything. Grants of land, transfers of the treasury, commands to the border companies. Appointments that would hollow out the loyal household and fill it with his own men, men like the two strangers who had not bowed at her door. She was not the crime, she was the noise the crime needed. "How long," she asked, "has Crane controlled which papers reach you? Since the winter, since your hand was weak?" She was thinking aloud now fast, the great wheel turning at speed. "And in that same time, how many of the old household company have been reassigned? Sent to distant posts, retired, replaced? You would not have noticed. Why would you? A guard changes, it means nothing." "But I noticed, Alden, because I know their faces. And this morning there were 2 men at my door I have never seen in my life, wearing the right colors and standing in the right place and belonging to him." Alden had gone very still, and she watched the man she had married come back into his own face, the king she had first loved, the one the winter's illness and a chancellor's quiet kindness had slowly leached away. Anger did that, she had always known. Anger could be a poison or a medicine depending entirely on where it was pointed, and Alden's anger, waking now, was pointing at last in the right direction. "He made me a signature," Alden said slowly. "He took my illness and he made me into a pen that he could hold, and he built it so gently that I thanked him for it." He looked at her. "The document that unmade you, where is it now?" "In my apartments. Corvin says it is a forgery of authority. The seal and hand are true, but no such law exists. It falls apart the instant anyone reads it against the rolls." She paused. "Which means Crane never meant it to be read against the rolls. He meant it to be believed for 3 days, long enough for the noise, long enough to finish whatever is meant to be finished before the council sits. Then we do the one thing he has built his entire scheme to prevent," said Alden. "We read the papers, all of them, every grant and appointment and transfer that has moved under my hand since the winter. Corvin keeps copies of everything sealed. It is the whole purpose of the rolls. If Crane has been moving the kingdom out from under me one signature at a time, then the proof is sitting in your friend's archive, and it has been sitting there the whole time, because a man who forges authority forgets that the man who keeps the record answers to no chancellor. For the first time since the wax had cracked under her thumb that morning, Rowena felt something that was almost hope. But it was a thin thing, and she did not trust it, because she had spent 12 years learning that in a palace, the moment you begin to see the shape of your enemy's plan is precisely the moment your enemy is most likely to change it. "There is a difficulty," she said. "Crane believes I have fled." "He told you I fled, which means the whole plan is built on my absence, on the disgraced queen running north in the night. The moment he learns I am still here, still in the palace, still asking questions, the moment he learns I have been to Corvin, and to you, he will know the noise has failed. And a man who has spent months quietly hollowing out a kingdom, Alden, is not a man who will simply accept that his curtain has been torn down. He will do the thing that men in his position always do when the slow plan fails." She did not have to name it. She saw the understanding arrive in her husband's eyes, cold and clear. "He will move to the fast one," Alden said. And even as he said it, they both heard it, the sound that changes everything in a palace on a morning already balanced on a knife. Not shouting, not alarm, something far quieter and far worse. The sound of many booted feet moving in step, moving with purpose, coming down the long corridor toward the king's apartments. The sound of the household company, or of the men who now wore its colors, being deployed. Rowena's hand found Alden's. 12 years, and she could not have said in that moment whether she took his hand for his comfort or her own. Below them, somewhere in the vast machinery of the palace, a wheel that had been turning slowly for months had just been thrown into its fastest gear, and there would be no stopping it now, no unwinding it, no quiet reading of papers in a dusty archive. Havard Crane had learned that his queen had not fled, and the marching feet in the corridor were his answer. "Whatever comes through that door," Rowena said, very low, "you are the king, not a pen, not a signature, the king. And I am still your queen, whatever 17 forged lines may say. They have built everything on us being too frightened or too divided or too slow. Let us disappoint them in all three at once." The footsteps stopped outside the door, and in the silence before it opened, Rowena of Valmere let go of her husband's hand and stepped forward and turned to face whatever her enemy had decided she was worth. The door opened without a knock. And that absence, the missing courtesy that every door in a palace is owed, told Rowena everything about the man who came through it before he had spoken a single word. Havard Crane did not knock at the king's door because Havard Crane no longer believed in the deepest part of himself that the room beyond it belonged to the king. He entered as a man enters a room he has already decided he owns. Behind him came 6 men in household colors, none of whom Rowena knew, and behind them the corridor was thick with more. He had brought enough force to end a small war. He had brought it, she understood, because he had run out of quieter options, and a man who reaches for the loud solution has already confessed that the quiet ones have failed him. "Your Majesty," Crane bowed to the king, a shallow thing, the bow of a man performing a habit he has stopped meaning. He did not look at Rowena at all. That, too, was a choice, and she noted it. He intended to erase her from the room by refusing to see her, to make her a ghost by treating her as one. "I am relieved to find you well. There has been a great deal of confusion this morning. Rumors. The former queen's flight has unsettled the household, and I thought it best to secure your person until the matter is settled." The former queen. He had said it lightly, in passing, the way you would mention weather. And in those 2 words, Rowena heard the whole of his strategy laid bare, because a lie, spoken confidently enough and early enough and often enough, does not need to be true to do its work. It only needs to be repeated until the repeating becomes its own kind of truth. Crane was not going to argue that the document was valid. He was simply going to behave in front of witnesses as though the question had already been settled, and he was betting that the men behind him, and the court beyond them, and eventually the whole kingdom, would follow the confidence rather than the fact. It was, Rowena thought with a cold and distant admiration, very nearly brilliant. It would have worked on almost anyone. It would have worked on the woman she had been 12 years ago, arriving frightened and unwanted into a court that had already decided to despise her. But she was not that woman anymore, and she had learned in 12 years the one thing that defeats a man who rules by confidence. You must be more certain than he is, and you must be certain out loud, in front of the same witnesses he is counting on to follow the stronger voice. "Lord Chancellor," she said, and she pitched her voice not to him but to the 6 men behind him, "how long did the seal remain out of its case?" Crane's head turned a fraction. It was the first time he had acknowledged her existence, and he had not meant to. The question had simply been too specific, too precisely aimed to ignore. "I don't take your meaning." "I think you do. The Great Seal never leaves its locked case except by the turning of your own key. You told me that yourself, 3 winters past, when you were proud of the responsibility rather than ashamed of it. So the men in this room might reasonably wonder. On the night before a document appeared bearing that seal and stripping a queen of a title that no law in Aldermere permits to be stripped, how long was the seal in your hands, and out of its case, and pressed to paper the king had not read?" She let that settle. "Because there is no law that unmakes a queen by council writ, Lord Chancellor. There never has been. The keeper of the rolls will swear to it, which means the document in my apartments is not an act of state. It is a forgery. And forgery of the Great Seal is not a matter of court intrigue. It is treason, the oldest and plainest treason there is." The room had gone very still, and Rowena watched with the particular attention of a woman whose life depended on it, the faces of the 6 men behind Crane, because those faces were the entire battlefield now. They were his men, bought or promoted or newly placed. But they were also, every one of them, men who had sworn an oath to the crown before they had ever heard the name Havard Crane, and an oath is a strange thing. It can lie dormant in a man for years. It can be buried under ambition and coin, and the 1,000 small compromises by which a decent man is slowly turned. But it does not die. And the word treason, spoken clearly in the king's own study, by a woman standing beside the living king, that word has a way of reaching down through all the compromises and touching the oath that still sleeps at the bottom. "She is distraught," said Crane, and for the first time there was something in his voice that had not been there before, a thin thread of strain, the sound of a man who feels the ground he has stood on so confidently beginning, very slightly, to move. "She has lost her position, and she is grasping at wild accusations. Take her to her apartments and keep her there until—" "No one in this room will touch the Queen." Alden had not raised his voice. He did not need to. He had simply stepped forward to stand beside his wife, and he had spoken with the flat authority of a man who has remembered, all at once, exactly who he is. "Havard, look at me. Not at the papers you have taught me to sign without reading. At me." And Crane looked, because a lifetime of instinct made him look, and Rowena saw the exact moment the Chancellor understood that the king he had spent a winter slowly hollowing into a signature had woken up. "You told me this morning that my wife had fled. She had not. You told me for months that the papers you brought me were routine. I begin to think they were not. And you have just told these men that a queen has been lawfully unmade. But the keeper of the rolls, who answers to no chancellor, will stand before this court and tell them there is no such law. So I find myself with a question, Havard, and I want you to answer it in front of these witnesses. If the document is lawful, bring me the statute. Name me the Act of Council. Show me in 600 years of the rolls the single instance where a queen was stripped by writ. Do that, and I will believe you served me faithfully." He paused. "And if you cannot, then every man in this room is standing in the presence of the man who forged the Great Seal, and the only question left is which of them wishes to be remembered as having stood with him." It was, Rowena would think long afterward, the finest thing she ever saw her husband do. Because he had not commanded the 6 men to turn on Crane, a command can be refused, and refusal, once begun, becomes its own courage. He had instead simply set the truth on the table between them and made each man choose which side of it he wished to be found standing on when the reckoning came. And a reckoning was coming. They could all feel it now, the way you feel the pressure change before a storm. Crane opened his mouth, and no statute came out of it, no act of council. No instance from the rolls. Because there was none, and in the silence where his proof should have been, every man in the room heard the exact sound of a lie that has finally reached the end of what confidence can carry it. The captain of the 6, a broad, weathered man named Holt, whom Rowena did not know but whose face she would remember for the rest of her life, was the first to move. He did not draw a weapon. He simply took one step deliberately sideways out from behind the Chancellor and toward the king. One step. It was the smallest gesture imaginable. And it was the whole rebellion, complete in a single motion, because the instant one man stepped away the spell of Crane's confidence broke, and the others saw that it could be done, that the ground was safe, that the oath at the bottom of them could be answered without being the only fool to answer it. One by one, in a silence more damning than any shout, the men Havard Crane had bought stepped out from behind him and left him standing alone in the center of the room he had walked into as though he owned it. "You have all been used," Rowena said to them quietly, and she meant it as mercy, because they would need to live with this mourning for the rest of their lives, and she did not wish them to live with it as villains. As I was, as the king was. There is no shame in having been deceived by a clever man. The shame would have been in choosing, once you saw clearly, to look away. They found it all in Corvin's archive. In the end, the whole slow architecture of it, laid out in copies the Chancellor had never imagined would matter, because he had forged authority and forgotten record. The grants of border land to men who owed him. The quiet transfers from the treasury. The reassignment, one careful order at a time, of every loyal man in the household company to a distant post, and their replacement with his own. It had been the work of months, patient and nearly invisible, each single act too small to notice. The whole of them together amounting to the quiet theft of a kingdom from a king too ill to read what he was signing. And the forged unmaking of the queen had been, exactly as Corvin had guessed, the curtain, the loud and scandalous thing that would have turned every eye in Aldermere away from the papers at the precise moment the last and largest of them were sealed. It had failed for the smallest of reasons. It had failed because a queen had noticed that 2 guards did not bow and had chosen to think instead of to weep. Havard Crane was tried before the full council sitting in open session, the very body he had forged a false version of to unmake her. He was not a man who broke at the end. He stood through the reading of the charges with the same cold composure he had carried through the king's door, and when he was given leave to speak in his defense, he said only that he had done what he did because he believed the king too weak to rule, and the kingdom too precious to leave in a failing hand. Perhaps some small part of him even believed it. Rowena had learned by then that the most dangerous men are rarely the ones who know themselves to be villains. They are the ones who have found a way to name their hunger a duty. She did not attend the sentencing. That surprised the court, which had expected the wronged queen to want her enemy's ruin witnessed and savored. But Rowena had discovered, somewhere in the long days of reading through the wreckage of what Crane had built, that she took no pleasure in it. He had been clever, and he had been wrong, and now the machinery of a real law, not a forged one, would decide what became of him. She found she wanted only to be done, and to have her kingdom quiet again, and to sit once more with the man she had married in a room where the papers on the table were the true kind. The title was never restored, because it had never truly been taken. That was the thing the whole court came slowly to understand, that a forgery unmakes nothing, that Rowena had been queen at every moment of that long morning, queen while she read the 17 lies, queen while she walked past guards who would not bow, queen while she faced 6 armed men in her husband's study with nothing in her hands but the truth. The document had had no power except the power everyone agreed to give it, and she had simply refused to agree. Corvin Ashby burned the forgery himself, in the grate of the East Library, on a gray afternoon a week after the trial. Rowena watched the wax seal blacken and run and vanish, and she thought about how strange it was that a thing which had seemed, at dawn on that first terrible morning, to hold the entire weight of her life, could turn out in the end to have held nothing at all, could turn out to be only paper, and a lie, and the fear the lie had briefly borrowed from her before she took it back. "You were never in it, you know," the old man said, watching the last of it burn. "The document, your name was on it, but you were never in it. They wrote a queen made of paper and set fire to her. The real one was never theirs to touch." He was quiet a moment. "I have kept the rolls 40 years, your majesty. I have watched a great many people try to make themselves powerful by writing it down. And I have learned that the things which truly hold, a marriage, a loyalty, an oath a man keeps when keeping it costs him everything, those things are never the things on the paper. The paper is only ever the shadow. You cannot strip a woman of what she actually is. You can only forge a document saying you have and hope she is frightened enough to believe you." Rowena watched the fire until there was nothing left of the thing that had tried to unmake her but a smear of ash and the smell of burnt wax. Somewhere below the window, a gardener had begun, tunelessly, to sing. She was still queen. She had never for a single moment been anything else.